This is the story of a man who walked in the furnace of a nation's idolatry and became a living flame for God. In a time when faith was a forgotten relic and the powers of heaven seemed silent, one voice dared to speak, one man dared to stand. His name was Elijah, a name that means, "My God is the Lord." He was a prophet of thunder and whispers, of drought and deluge, of fire and fear. He would confront wicked royals, command the skies, raise the dead, and challenge an entire empire of false gods, armed with nothing but the word of his God. This is the journey of the Tishbite, the man who would be so consumed by his mission that death itself could not hold him, who would ascend to heaven not in a grave, but in a whirlwind and a chariot of fire. His story is a blazing testament that even in the deepest darkness, God is preparing his answer. Our story begins in the northern kingdom of Israel, a nation spiritually hollowed out, led by a king whose heart was a vacuum waiting to be filled by darkness. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, a new name ascended the throne of Israel, Ahab, the son of Omri. The scripture gives us a chilling introduction. 1 Kings 16 verse 30 states plainly, "Now Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him." Think about that. This wasn't a nation new to rebellion. This was a kingdom founded on it. For decades, Israel had been bowing to the golden calves set up by their first king, Jeroboam. That was the original sin of the northern kingdom, a political religion designed to keep the people from worshiping in Jerusalem. It was a sin of convenience, a corruption of the true faith. But for Ahab, this generational rebellion, this comfortable state-sponsored idolatry, was not enough. The Bible describes it with shocking clarity. "And it came to pass, as if it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took as wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians." The sin of Jeroboam had become trivial. It was casual, everyday rebellion. It was the background noise of their culture. Ahab wasn't content to simply inherit a compromised faith. He wanted to actively dismantle it. He looked at the spiritual treason of his forefathers and considered it child's play. He was ambitious in his wickedness, searching for a deeper, more profound way to defy the God of Israel. And he found it in a political alliance that would seal his nation's doom. He didn't just make a treaty with the Sidonians. He made a covenant with their gods by marrying their high priestess. This marriage to Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, a name which literally means "with Baal," wasn't just a political blunder. It was spiritual suicide. It was the deliberate, calculated invitation for an ancient evil to come and possess the throne of Israel. Ahab didn't just open the door to Baal worship. He rolled out the red carpet, handed Jezebel the keys to the kingdom, and gave her a mandate to remake the nation in her own dark image. The trivial sins of the past were about to be eclipsed by an aggressive, all-consuming evil. This foreign princess, a zealot for her pagan gods, would accomplish what no foreign army ever could. She didn't just bring her idols with her. She brought her missionary zeal. Jezebel wasn't content to be a quiet partner in Ahab's kingdom. She intended to be its high priestess. The worship of Baal, the Canaanite storm and fertility god, wasn't just tolerated. It was institutionalized. This was the god her people believed held the power over the rain, the clouds, and the harvest. For an agricultural society like Israel, constantly at the mercy of the weather, the appeal was seductive. Why trust an unseen, invisible God who demanded moral purity when you could appease a tangible idol that promised material prosperity? Baalism was a religion of the senses, full of ecstatic rituals, cultic prostitution, and the promise of immediate results. It was a faith that demanded everything from its followers except their hearts. Ahab, completely enthralled by his new wife, dove headfirst into this abyss. 1 Kings 16 verse 32 records his brazen act of national treason. Then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. He didn't just build a small shrine in a private corner of the palace. He built a temple, a grand public statement of his new allegiance right in the capital city. He was declaring to the world that Baal, not Yahweh, was the official God of Israel. But his spiritual adultery didn't stop there. The very next verse tells us, "And Ahab made a wooden image." This was the Asherah pole, the symbol of Baal's female consort, a goddess of fertility. This act plunged Israel into the lowest depths of pagan depravity, embracing the sexualized, debased rituals that came with it. The scripture concludes with this damning verdict: Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. All the rebellion, all the golden calves, all the high places, all of it was dwarfed by this. Ahab hadn't just broken the first commandment, he had shattered it and ground it into dust under his heel. He had taken the bride of Yahweh, the nation of Israel, and formally delivered her into the hands of a false god. The land was infected. The spiritual plague spread from the throne room to the village square. Priests of the Lord were silenced or hunted down, while the prophets of Baal and Asherah feasted at the royal table, paid for by the state. The people, seeing their king's bold apostasy and fearing the queen's ruthless power, quickly followed suit. Altars to Baal sprouted on every high hill and under every green tree. The worship of the one true God became a whisper, a hunted memory in a land now screaming the name of Baal. The nation was spiritually dead, but God was not silent, and he was not finished. While the royal court in Samaria rotted from the inside out, God was preparing his answer. He wasn't looking in the seminaries or the noble houses. He was looking to the wilderness. Far from the corrupted cities, in the rugged, wild highlands of Gilead, across the Jordan River, lived a man forged by that harsh landscape. A man whose very name was a declaration of war against the new state religion. His name was Elijah. My God is Yahweh. The Bible introduces him with no fanfare, no genealogy, no backstory. He simply appears, a man of fire and mystery. 1 Kings 17 verse 1 drops him into the narrative like a lightning bolt from a clear sky. And Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, "That's all we get." He's from Gilead, a rugged, untamed land known for its fierce warriors and isolation. He's not a product of the royal court or the religious schools. He hasn't been corrupted by the sophisticated pagan-infused culture of Samaria. He is a man of the wilderness, and he carries the raw, unfiltered authority of the God of that wilderness. Picture the scene. King Ahab is in his palace, surrounded by the trappings of his ill-gotten power, perhaps listening to the whispers of his manipulative queen. The air is thick with the scent of pagan incense, and suddenly, standing before him is this man. He probably smells of the desert, his clothes are rough, his hair is wild, and his eyes are burning with a divine fire. He didn't send a messenger. He didn't request an audience. He simply stands before the king, an unauthorized, uninvited, and terrifying presence. The court officials are stunned into silence. The guards are frozen. Who is this man who dares to breach the royal presence? And then he speaks. His words are not a plea. They are not a negotiation. They are a judgment. As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word. Let's break down this divine declaration of war. He begins, as the Lord God of Israel lives. This is the opening shot. In the land where the king and queen are championing a God of stone and wood, Elijah declares that his God, Yahweh, is the living God. He's drawing a line in the sand. Your God is a dead idol. My God is the one who breathes and acts, before whom I stand. This isn't just a physical statement. It's a statement of authority. Elijah isn't standing before Ahab. He is standing before God as his servant, his ambassador. In that moment, Ahab isn't the one with the power. He's just the audience for a message from the true king. And then the sentence, "There shall not be dew nor rain these years." This was not a random curse. This was a precision strike, aimed directly at the heart of Jezebel's religion. Baal was the god of the storm. Baal was the rider of the clouds. Baal was the one who supposedly opened the storehouses of heaven to send the rain that made the crops grow. Elijah, as the spokesman for Yahweh, essentially looked Baal in the face and said, "You think you control the weather? Prove it." He was challenging Baal on his own turf in front of his own worshippers. God was about to demonstrate in the most painful way possible who truly held the keys to the sky. And notice the final devastating clause, "Except at my word, not at Ahab's plea," not at the frantic sacrifices of the Baal worshippers. God was vesting the authority to turn the rain on and off in his one faithful prophet. The entire nation's survival would now hinge on the word of the very man the king would come to despise. It was a total humiliation of the monarchy and its new religion. After delivering this message, this spiritual time bomb, Elijah doesn't wait for a reply. He doesn't wait to be arrested. His work here is done. The word has been spoken and the judgment has begun. Instantly, Elijah becomes the most wanted man in Israel. He has just publicly humiliated the king and declared economic and ecological war on the entire nation. Ahab, and especially the vengeful, ruthless Jezebel, would tear the kingdom apart to find him. He is a dead man walking, but the God who sent him with the message now provides him with the escape route. The word of the Lord comes to him again, not with a command for confrontation, but for concealment. 1 Kings 17 verses 2 and 3 tell us, "Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Get away from here and turn eastward, and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan." God's instruction is precise. Go east, back toward his homeland of Gilead, to a specific secluded ravine. He is to hide. The man who just stood boldly in a palace is now called to disappear completely. This is the other side of faith. There is a time to stand and speak, and there is a time to be hidden and silent. Elijah's obedience had to be just as absolute in the hiding as it was in the confronting. He was trading the royal court for a desolate gorge, the king's fury for God's protection. This wasn't just about saving Elijah's life. It was about training him. God was taking his prophet into a private school of faith, a place of total dependency. The brook Cherith would be his sanctuary, his proving ground. And then God reveals the most bizarre and miraculous provision plan. Verse 4, "And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." Water from the brook, that made sense. But food from ravens? In the meticulous code of Jewish law, ravens were unclean birds. They were scavengers, eaters of carrion. They were the last creature a faithful Jew would ever want handling his food. This was a radical test of Elijah's trust and his willingness to abandon his own religious sensibilities. God was deliberately choosing the most unlikely, the most unclean, the most despised of creatures to be his divine caterers. He was teaching Elijah a profound lesson right from the start. God's provision doesn't have to fit our expectations. It doesn't have to look clean or logical or religious. He is the Lord of all creation, and he can command anything, even an unclean raven, to serve his purposes and care for his children. So Elijah goes. Verse 5 says, "So he went and did according to the word of the Lord." No argument, no questions, just simple, profound obedience. And the miracle unfolds day after day. Verse 6, "The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook." Twice a day, every day, the ravens came, not with scraps, but with bread and meat. This was a feast in the wilderness, while the kingdom of Israel, with its fertile fields and royal storehouses, began to starve. God's lone prophet was being fed sumptuously by scavengers in a dry ravine, while Ahab and Jezebel frantically prayed to their lifeless God of the harvest. Yahweh was demonstrating his total power by turning the most unlikely birds into faithful servants. This was Elijah's life for months. In this isolation, God was stripping him of all self-reliance, forcing him to depend on nothing but the daily, miraculous intervention of his God. Month after agonizing month, the land of Israel baked under a cloudless bronze sky. The drought that Elijah had proclaimed was not a suggestion, it was a suffocating reality. The fertile plains of Jezreel turned to dust. The vineyards withered. Livestock, ribs showing through their hides, collapsed in the parched fields. The economy of the nation, built on the very harvests Baal was supposed to provide, crumbled to nothing. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, trapped in their palace, watched their kingdom die of thirst, all while frantically, futilely sacrificing to their silent, powerless God. And in his hidden ravine, Elijah watched too. He watched as the judgment he had announced took its relentless toll. And he watched as his own lifeline, the brook Cherith, began to shrink. The gurgling stream that had been his constant companion became a trickle. The trickle gave way to scattered pools. And then one day the pools vanished, leaving nothing but cracked mud and dry stones. The ravens had been faithful. The brook had been faithful. But now, one half of his divine provision was gone. This wasn't a failure of God's plan. It was the scheduled end of this season. God had sustained him at Cherith for as long as he intended. Now the dry creek bed was God's signal that it was time to move. Elijah's faith, which had been built up by the miraculous daily bread, was now being tested. He didn't panic. He didn't try to dig for water. He waited. He had learned to listen for the next command. And just as the last drop of water disappeared, the word of the Lord came. 1 Kings 17, verses 8 and 9. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." This command must have hit Elijah like a physical blow. It was shocking, illogical, and terrifying on every conceivable level. First, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon. Sidon. This was the very heart of the enemy's territory. This was the homeland of Jezebel. This was the epicenter of Baal worship, the place where the poison had originated. God wasn't just sending him out of Israel. He was sending him into the lion's den, the last place on earth anyone would ever look for the prophet of Yahweh. It was the perfect hiding place precisely because it was so impossibly dangerous. Second, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. A widow. In the ancient world, widows were the symbol of poverty. They were destitute, with no husband to protect or provide for them, and this was a pagan widow in a pagan land, suffering under the same global drought and famine. How could a starving, vulnerable woman possibly provide for a grown man? This was a test that went even deeper than the ravens. God was asking Elijah to place his life, his daily survival, in the hands of the weakest, most powerless, most unlikely person imaginable. God was systematically dismantling every form of human security. He had taken Elijah from the palace to the wilderness, and now from the wilderness to the heart of enemy territory. He had moved his provision from unclean birds to a destitute pagan. This was a radical lesson in faith, proving that God's power is not limited by geography, religion, or social status. So what did Elijah do? He did the only thing he knew how to do. He obeyed. He got up from the dry, dusty brook, turned his back on his homeland, and began the long, perilous journey northwest. Every step took him deeper into enemy territory, deeper into the heart of the famine. The land was a skeleton of its former self, bleached and broken. He was a fugitive, traveling alone, with no supplies, heading toward the one place on earth that would want him dead more than any other: Sidon, the homeland of Queen Jezebel. After a long and grueling journey, he finally arrived, exhausted and parched, at the city gates of Zarephath. This was the belly of the beast, and just as God had promised, he saw her. 1 Kings 17, verse 10. And when he came to the gate of the city, indeed, a widow was there gathering sticks. She was the picture of desperation, a poor widow scrounging for a few meager sticks to make a fire. She was at the bottom of the social ladder, a pagan woman in a pagan land. With nothing and no one, this was God's chosen instrument of salvation. Elijah, led by the Spirit, called out to her, "Please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink." The request was a test. In a land gripped by a deadly drought, water was precious. To give a drink to a stranger, a foreigner, was an act of profound, possibly costly kindness. The woman didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She turned to go and get him the water, her heart still open to compassion even in the face of starvation. And as she was walking away, Elijah raised the stakes. This was the real test. He called to her and said, "Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." This was the breaking point. The woman stopped. The simple kindness she was about to show turned into an impossible demand. She turned back to this strange man, her voice cracking with the full, devastating weight of her reality. Her response is one of the most heartbreaking moments in all of Scripture. Though she said, "As the Lord your God lives," that is, she calls him your God. She doesn't know him yet. "I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." This wasn't just a casual complaint. This was her final act. The sticks she was gathering were for her own funeral pyre, in a manner of speaking. She was preparing a last supper for herself and her child. After this one tiny, pathetic cake of bread, there was nothing. Only the slow, agonizing wait for starvation and death. This is what Elijah had been sent to. This was the provision God had commanded for him. A dying woman and her son, a handful of flour, a little oil. This was the plan. From a human perspective, it was a cruel joke. Elijah should have been the one to provide for her. But God's economy is not human economy. His ways are higher than our ways. Elijah, his own heart surely moved by her plight, but his focus locked on the word of his God, looked at this broken woman and spoke. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't apologize for his request. He offered her a command, and with it a lifeline. 1 Kings 17 verse 13, "And Elijah said to her, 'Do not fear.'" This is the first thing he says. He speaks to her greatest emotion, fear. The fear of starvation, the fear of death, the fear of watching her child die. Do not fear. He is offering her an alternative to the terror that is consuming her. "Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son." This is the test. It's one of the most brutal tests of faith in the entire Bible. Give first to God, represented by his prophet. Take the very last thing you have, the meal you were about to use to die, and give it away. It's a command that defies all logic, all reason, all maternal instinct. He's asking her to choose between the certain visible end of her resources and the invisible, unproven promise of a foreign god. He's asking her to put her obedience on the altar before she sees the provision. This wasn't cruelty. This was the mechanism of the miracle. God was waiting for her yes. He needed an act of impossible faith to unleash an act of impossible provision, and then he gives her the reason. This isn't a blind demand, it's a divine contract. Verse 14, "For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." This was the promise. He was asking her to trade her single, final meal for a supernatural, unending supply. He was inviting her from a world of desperate scarcity into a world of divine abundance. He was telling her that her tiny handful of flour, if given in faith, was the seed for a harvest that would last for years. The choice was hers. Trust what she could see, the near-empty bin, the last drops of oil, the face of her hungry son. Or trust what she had heard, the promise of a prophet from a God she did not know. And in that moment, this pagan widow, this woman with no name, no status, and no hope, made a choice that shamed an entire nation. She chose faith. She looked past the terrifying reality of her senses and put her trust in the promise of Elijah's God. 1 Kings 17 verse 15 is a masterpiece of simple, world-changing obedience. So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah. Can you imagine that moment? The agonizing walk back to her small home, her hands trembling as she reached into the bin for that last handful of flour. She bakes a small cake and, walking past her hungry, watching son, she takes it out and gives it to the prophet first. It was an act of complete and total surrender. And the moment she gave, God multiplied. She went back to the bin to make a cake for herself and her son, as Elijah had said, and there was flour. She scooped it out, and there was still flour underneath. She went to the jar to pour the last drops of oil, and the oil kept pouring. The miracle had begun, and it didn't stop. Verse 15 continues, "And she and he and her household ate for many days." The many days would stretch into months and then into years. Every single morning, she would wake up to the same impossible reality. The bin was never empty. The jar was never dry. While the nation of Israel starved, while Jezebel's prophets cried out to a silent sky, this little household of three, a pagan widow, her young son, and the prophet of Yahweh, ate. They lived as a bubble of divine provision in a world of desolation. God had turned her last meal into an endless feast. He had honored her mustard seed of faith with a mountain of faithfulness. Life settled into a new, miraculous routine. They had food. They had fellowship. The prophet was no longer just a stranger, but a part of their home. And then, just when life seemed to have found a rhythm of grace, tragedy struck. The fragile peace of this supernatural household was shattered. 1 Kings 17, verse 17. Now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick. And his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. The boy was dead. The very miracle that had sustained their lives had now been eclipsed by the one tragedy that could shatter it all. The house that had echoed with the sound of grinding flour now fell silent, filled with the impossible grief of a mother's wail. The provision of life had been followed by the visitation of death. And in her agony, the widow's faith, built over months of miracles, broke. She turned on the one man who had been their link to the supernatural. Her words, recorded in 1 Kings 17, verse 18, are a scream of pain, confusion, and accusation. So she said to Elijah, "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" This wasn't just grief. This was terror. She believed that Elijah's holiness, his sheer proximity to the divine, had acted like a spotlight, illuminating her own past sins and failings, and that this holy God had now struck her son down in judgment. The man she had hosted as a blessing, she now accused of being a curse. The miracle of the flour and oil was forgotten, erased by the brutal finality of her son's lifeless body. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't defend his God. He didn't try to explain the complex mysteries of suffering. He met her agony with a quiet, compassionate authority. Verse 19, "And he said to her, 'Give me your son.'" He didn't shy away from the tragedy. He entered into it. He took the limp, lifeless body from her arms. Imagine that moment. The prophet of fire, the man who commanded the skies, now holding the small, cold body of a dead child. He carried him up to his own room, the upper chamber where he had lived and prayed, and he laid the boy on his own bed. This was now personal. This tragedy wasn't just the widow's, it was his. God had sent him here. This death had happened on his watch, alone in the upper room with the devastating evidence of a promise gone wrong. Elijah did the only thing he knew how to do. He brought his own crisis of faith directly to God, and his prayer was not a polite request. It was a raw, confused, and desperate cry. Verse 20, "Then he cried out to the Lord and said, 'O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge by killing her son?'" This is an astonishing prayer. He's not blaming the widow's sin. He's not blaming some dark force. He is holding God accountable. "Have you done this? You sent me here. You provided for this widow, and now you have brought this evil upon her." Elijah was just as confused as the widow, and he was not afraid to say so. But his confusion did not lead to paralysis. It led to action. He had confronted God with his why, and now he would petition God with his what. He didn't just pray about the boy. He prayed over him, engaging in one of the strangest and most profound acts of intercession ever recorded. 1 Kings 17, verse 21, describes the scene. "And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord." This was not a tidy, hands-folded prayer. This was a desperate, physical, all-consuming act. 3 times, the prophet of fire laid his living body over the dead, cold form of the child. It was a bizarre and symbolic act. Was he trying to impart his own life breath, his own warmth? Was he demonstrating to God a total identification with the tragedy? Or was he engaging in a spiritual battle, a wrestling match with death itself? Claiming this body back for the God of life? Whatever the precise meaning, it was an act of raw, persistent, and borderline frantic faith, and with each prostration, his cry grew more focused, moving from questioning God to commanding the impossible in God's name. His final cry was not a question, but a plea that bordered on a demand. "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." He was asking for something that had never happened before in human history. He was asking God to reverse the irreversible, to unwind the very gears of death. He was asking for a resurrection. And in that quiet upper room, heaven ripped open. Verse 22 is the stunning, simple response. Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. There must have been a gasp, a first halting breath that filled the dead silence. The child's eyes flickered open. The cold skin grew warm. The small chest that had been still rose and fell. Life, defiant and miraculous, flooded back into the boy's body. The God who had closed the heavens in judgment had now opened the gates of Sheol in mercy. He had proven his power not just over the weather, but over the grave. Elijah's heart must have felt like it would explode. The overwhelming relief, the vindication, the sheer joy of seeing this impossible answer. He didn't waste a moment. He picked up the living, breathing child, the child who was dead just moments before, and carried him down from the upper room. He walked back into the main house, where the widow was surely drowning in her grief, her cries echoing in the now empty home. He found her, and he held out her son. Verse 23 captures the beautiful simplicity of the moment. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house, and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." The woman stared. Her mind, shattered by grief, could barely process the sight. This wasn't a vision. This wasn't a cruel trick. Her son, warm and breathing, was looking at her. She must have snatched him from Elijah's arms, crushing him to her chest, feeling the impossible rhythm of his heartbeat, the warmth of his skin. Her sobs of agony turned into gasps of disbelief, then into a cry of overwhelming, uncontainable joy. He was alive. He was alive. After a long moment, her eyes, still wet with tears, lifted from her son's face and fixed on the prophet. The man she had accused, the man she had cursed, the man who had just dismantled death itself in her upper room. Her fear was gone, replaced by a profound, earth-shaking awe. 1 Kings 17, verse 24, records her complete and total surrender. Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." The miracle of the flour and oil had been a miracle of provision. It had kept them from dying. But this was a miracle of power. This was a resurrection. This was the final, undeniable proof. She wasn't just housing a prophet. She was in the presence of the one true God, the God who ruled not just the rain and the oil, but life and death itself. Her faith was now sealed, not by a full stomach, but by an empty grave. With this, Elijah's long season of hiding was over. His training in the wilderness was complete. He had learned dependence by the brook, faith in the house of a pagan, and now he had witnessed the ultimate power of his God over the grave. He was ready. Back in Israel, the land was a corpse. The Bible tells us it was now the 3rd year, 3.5 long, brutal years since a single drop of rain or dew had touched the soil. The kingdom was a landscape of dust and bones. The famine was so severe that King Ahab himself was on a desperate personal mission to save his last remaining livestock. The nation was utterly broken, brought to its knees by the power of Elijah's word. And at this exact critical moment, the word of the Lord came to Elijah once more. 1 Kings 18, verse 1. And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, "Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth." The command was staggering. Go, present yourself to Ahab. This wasn't hiding. This was a direct, willing walk into the executioner's chamber. Ahab, the man who had been tearing the world apart looking for him, the man who blamed him for every dead cow and withered field. But the command came with a promise, "And I will send rain." The judgment was ending. The time for the final confrontation had arrived. So Elijah obeyed. He left the safety of Zarephath, the home that had been his refuge and his miracle ground, and set out for the capital, Samaria. He was walking from the land of Baal back into the land that should have been the Lord's, a land now groaning under a judgment of its own making. As Elijah traveled, King Ahab was also on the move, but his mission was one of desperation. The famine was so complete that the royal stables were empty. The king's own horses and mules were dying. Ahab had been reduced from a mighty king to a desperate rancher, scouring the land for any last patch of grass or spring of water. And to do this, he split the search party. He would go one way, and he sent his most trusted servant, the man who was in charge of his entire palace, in another. This man's name was Obadiah. But Obadiah had a secret, a massive, life-threatening secret. 1 Kings 18 verse 3 gives us this shocking insight. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. This wasn't a casual belief. This was a deep, abiding, and dangerous faith. He was a true believer, living and serving in the very heart of the enemy's stronghold. He was the highest-ranking official in the palace of Ahab and Jezebel, yet his heart belonged to Yahweh. And his faith wasn't passive. Verse 4 tells us that when Jezebel was massacring the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them, 50 to a cave, and had fed them with bread and water. This man was a hero, a quiet resistor. While Elijah was being fed by ravens, Obadiah was running a secret high-stakes operation, using his own position and resources to save the last remnants of God's servants right under the queen's nose. Every single day, he was risking a gruesome execution for his loyalty to God. So here is this faithful man, Obadiah, walking down a dusty road on a desperate search for animal fodder when he looks up, and his blood runs cold. Verse 7, "Now as Obadiah was on his way, suddenly Elijah met him." Obadiah knew exactly who this was. This was the man who had started it all, the man who had disappeared, the most wanted man in the world. Ahab had sent search parties to every surrounding nation with oaths and treaties, trying to find him. And now he was just standing here. Obadiah immediately fell on his face. This was not just respect for a prophet. This was terror. "Is it you, my lord Elijah?" Elijah's reply was simple and direct. "It is I. Go, tell your master Elijah is here." This command was for Obadiah a death sentence. He was horrified. Obadiah's reaction was immediate and desperate. He wasn't just afraid. He was convinced this was a trap that would lead to his own execution. He launched into a frantic plea, recorded in 1 Kings 18 verses 9 to 14. "What sin have I committed, that you are delivering your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me?" He was essentially saying, "Elijah, I'm on your side. Why are you setting me up to be slaughtered?" He then lays out his case, revealing the deadly tightrope he had been walking for years. "As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent to hunt for you." He describes how Ahab has made entire kingdoms swear an oath that they couldn't find the prophet. The king's obsession with finding Elijah was total. Then Obadiah reveals his secret. "Was it not told to my lord what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord? How I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water?" He's making a desperate appeal. "I am one of the good guys. I've been risking my life daily, right under the noses of the king and queen, to save God's people. Don't you see?" His fear was painfully logical. "And now you say, 'Go, tell your master Elijah is here.' And it will happen as soon as I am gone from you, that the Spirit of the Lord will carry you to a place I do not know. So when I come and tell Ahab, and he cannot find you, he will kill me." Obadiah had seen enough of God's miraculous protection of Elijah to know that the prophet could vanish in an instant. And he knew Ahab's temper. If he reported Elijah's presence and Elijah disappeared, Ahab's rage would fall on the nearest target, him. Elijah understood the man's legitimate terror. He wasn't dealing with a coward, but with a faithful, terrified man caught between a rock and a hard place. So Elijah gave him something he had given no one else, a divine, unbreakable oath. Verse 15, Then Elijah said, As the Lord of hosts lives before whom I stand, I will surely present myself to him today. This was a promise sealed with the name of God, the Lord of hosts, the commander of heaven's armies. Elijah was swearing that this was not a mirage, not a test. The disappearing act was over. The confrontation would happen today. This was all Obadiah needed. The prophet's word was his guarantee, so he went. He went to meet Ahab and told him. Ahab, hearing the news, must have felt a jolt of shock, rage, and perhaps even a twisted sense of relief. The man he blamed for 3.5 years of national agony, the ghost he had been chasing across the world, was finally in his grasp. The Bible simply says Ahab went to meet Elijah. The long-avoided, divinely ordained showdown was about to happen. They met on a dusty road in a kingdom of skeletons. It wasn't in the splendor of the palace. It was in the desolation Ahab had helped create. The king, in his royal chariot, stared down at the wild-eyed prophet who had haunted his nightmares for 3.5 years. Ahab, his voice thick with rage and frustration, spoke first. His words reveal a man so blinded by his own sin he could no longer see reality. 1 Kings 18 verse 17. And it happened, when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, Is that you, O troubler of Israel? Troubler of Israel. He blamed Elijah for the drought. He blamed the prophet for the famine, the economic ruin, the dying livestock. In Ahab's mind, the man who announced the judgment was the problem, not the sin that caused it. It was the ultimate act of projection. If Elijah had just kept his mouth shut, none of this would have happened. Elijah, standing in the full power of the Lord of hosts, did not flinch. He did not bow. He did not apologize. He was the one man in Israel who was not afraid of the king. He met Ahab's glare and spoke the unvarnished, terrifying truth. Verse 18, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals. He threw the accusation right back in the king's face, diagnosing the nation's sickness with perfect precision. The problem isn't me, your majesty. The problem is you. The problem is your apostasy. The problem is your rebellion. The land isn't dying because of my prayer. It's dying because of your sin. And then, before Ahab could even respond, Elijah pressed his advantage. He didn't just come to accuse, he came to act. He, a hunted fugitive, began to give commands to the king. Verse 19, Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. This was the challenge. This was the divine gauntlet being thrown down. And what a challenge it was. First, gather all Israel. This would not be a private debate. This would be a public tribunal in front of the entire nation. God's victory would be public. Second, Mount Carmel, a strategic location, a high place, visible for miles, and crucially, a place that overlooked the Mediterranean Sea, the very sea from which the rain was supposed to come. Third, the guest list. The 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah. Elijah wasn't just challenging a few priests. He was calling out the entire state-funded religious infrastructure. All 850 of them, the ones who had Jezebel's personal favor, who eat at Jezebel's table. It was 850 to 1. The odds were absurd, impossible, and completely by divine design. And Ahab, in his desperation, agreed. He had to. His nation was dead, and this terrifying prophet, who had demonstrably controlled the skies for 3.5 years, was now offering a path to reign. For Ahab, this was a desperate gamble to end the famine. For God, this was the final exam for a nation. So the royal messengers were sent. The call went out to all the tribes of Israel. "Come to Carmel," and they came. A gaunt, sun-scorched and spiritually starved populace gathered on the slopes of the great mountain. And with them came the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, a sea of priestly robes, arrogant and confident, protected by the crown. They were the religious celebrities of their day, and they were about to perform for their king. And then there was Elijah, one man against 850, one man against an entire nation's apostasy. He stood before the restless, murmuring crowd. The air was thick with tension. He let the silence hang for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces of his countrymen, faces etched with hunger and worse, confusion. Then he spoke, his voice thundering across the mountaintop. 1 Kings 18 verse 21. And Elijah came to all the people and said, "How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." This was the question, the ultimate spiritual challenge. How long will you limp on two divided crutches? He accused them of spiritual adultery, of trying to have it both ways, of paying lip service to Yahweh in their history books while building altars to Baal in their backyards. He demanded a choice, pick a side, Yahweh or Baal, life or death. And what was the people's response to this fiery, foundational question? But the people answered him not a word. Silence, the silence of guilt, the silence of confusion, the silence of fear. They had no answer. Their spiritual paralysis was total. So Elijah, seeing their cowardly silence, proposed a test that would force an answer. He would remove all doubt. He laid out the terms for the ultimate divine contest. Verse 22, "Then Elijah said to the people, I alone am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men." He was highlighting the odds, showing them the sheer scale of the supposed contest. "Therefore let them give us 2 bulls. Let them choose one, cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. Then you call on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." This was the test, a test of fire. This was brilliant, a divine masterstroke. Baal was the god of the storm, the one who rode the clouds, the one who hurled the lightning bolt. Elijah was challenging Baal to do his one job. He was inviting the false god to show up for his own party, on his own terms. The people, who had been silent in the face of a moral challenge, were suddenly energized by the prospect of a supernatural spectacle. So all the people answered and said, "It is well spoken." They loved the idea. This was high-stakes entertainment. Elijah, with a gesture of magnanimous confidence, turned to the 450 prophets of Baal. "Choose one bull for yourselves, and prepare it first," he said, "for you are many, and call on the name of your God, but put no fire under it." He was giving them every advantage. The first choice, the home field advantage, Baal's high place, and the majority. So they took the bull, prepared it with all the elaborate rituals of their faith, and laid it on their altar. And then they began to call. 1 Kings 18 verse 26. So they took the bull, and they called on the name of Baal from morning even until noon, saying, "O Baal, hear us." And imagine the scene, the desperate men chanting, singing, dancing, shouting at the sky. "O Baal, hear us, O Baal, hear us." The sound must have been deafening, a hypnotic, frenzied roar echoing across the mountain. The people watched, waiting, but the sky remained a silent, empty bronze. But there was no voice. No one answered. Their desperation grew. They began to leap, to dance wildly about the altar which they had made. This was not a calm, respectful prayer. This was a frantic, pagan ecstasy, a physical attempt to force a response from their God, and nothing. At noon, with the sun at its highest, most merciless point, Elijah began to mock them. He had let them exhaust themselves for hours. Now he twisted the knife. His taunts, recorded in verse 27, are dripping with savage, holy sarcasm. "Cry aloud," he shouted over their chanting, "for he is a god." Either he is meditating. Maybe he's in a deep thought and can't be disturbed. Or he is busy. The Hebrew literally means gone to the side, a polite way of saying he's in the restroom. Or he is on a journey, or perhaps he's on vacation. Or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. Your rider of the clouds is taking a nap. This mockery, this public humiliation, drove the prophets of Baal into a complete terrifying frenzy. They were no longer just shouting, they were screaming, and they escalated their ritual to its darkest form. Verse 28, "So they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances, until the blood gushed out on them." And this was the horrific reality of their faith. If the God would not answer, they had to appease him with their own blood. The altar, which was supposed to receive fire from heaven, was now just drenched in the blood of its own priests. The mountaintop had become a scene of gory, demonic desperation, and they kept this up for hours. Verse 29, "And it was so, when midday was past, that they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. All afternoon they raved, they bled, they screamed. The sun began to dip toward the sea." The time for the evening sacrifice, the traditional time of prayer for Yahweh, was approaching. Their time was up and the verdict was in. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. Their God was dead, or he was nothing. The stage was silent. The raves, the screams, the gushing of blood. It had all faded into an exhausted, humiliated quiet. The 450 prophets of Baal stood defeated, covered in their own blood, their altar a cold, wet mockery. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the mountain. The entire nation of Israel, having watched this pathetic display all day, was now holding its collective breath, their eyes turning from the 450 defeated priests to the one lone man. Elijah stepped forward into this void. He didn't gloat, he didn't mock them further. His moment had come. He turned to the people, the silent, paralyzed crowd. His first action was one of invitation and restoration. And Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." So all the people came near to him. He was gathering them back, calling them out of their passive observation. And then he did something profoundly symbolic. He didn't build a new, flashy altar. 1 Kings 18 verse 30 says, "And he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down." There had been an altar to Yahweh on this mountain, and the people had allowed it to fall into ruin. His first act was one of restoration, of returning to the old paths. He gathered 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." This wasn't just construction, it was a sermon in stone. He was reminding the northern kingdom, in their state of secession and apostasy, that they were still part of the covenant. He was spiritually reuniting the divided nation before God. With these 12 stones, he rebuilt the altar in the name of the Lord. He then dug a deep trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. Then he methodically laid the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. It was all done with care, with reverence, following the proper order. And then, with the sacrifice prepared, Elijah gave a command so baffling, so counterintuitive, that it must have stunned the crowd. Verse 33, "And he said, 'Fill 4 water pots with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood.'" You could have heard a pin drop water. This was a land that hadn't seen rain in 3.5 years. Water was the most precious commodity on earth. It was liquid gold. They were probably rationing it by the cupful. And Elijah wanted to waste it, to pour it on a fire that wasn't even lit. But his command was absolute. They obeyed. 4 large jars were filled and emptied, drenching the wood and the offering. Elijah was just getting started. "Do it a second time," he commanded. They did it again. The sacrifice was now a sodden mess. The wood was soaked through. "Do it a 3rd time," he cried. And they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down from the altar, completely filling the deep trench he had dug around it. Now this wasn't just a test, it was an impossibility. He had deliberately created a waterlogged, fireproof scene. There was no trickery, no possibility of a hidden coal. He was making the miracle as stark and undeniable as it could possibly be. Then, as the appointed time for the evening sacrifice arrived, the sacred hour of prayer, Elijah the prophet stepped up to the dripping altar. He didn't shout, he didn't cut himself. He simply spoke. He lifted his voice to heaven, and he prayed a prayer of such confidence, clarity, and power that it must have frozen every heart on the mountain. Verse 36, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again. It was a simple 63-word prayer. It took less than 30 seconds to speak. But it was a prayer that hinged on the covenant, declared his servanthood, and asked only for God's glory and the people's restoration. The prayer had barely left his lips when the sky tore open. 1 Kings 18, verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell. It wasn't a spark. It wasn't a flickering flame. It was a column of divine celestial fire. A blinding shaft of pure power that descended from the cloudless sky. It struck the altar with a sound like thunder, an explosion of light and heat that must have thrown the nearest onlookers to the ground. And it consumed, it didn't just burn the sacrifice, it vaporized it. The fire of God devoured in an instant the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust. The very stones of the altar, the 12 covenant reminders, were incinerated. The dust of the earth beneath it was gone. And then, with a supernatural hiss, the fire licked up the water that was in the trench. The impossible, waterlogged sacrifice, the soaked wood, the 12 massive stones, the very ground they sat on, and a trench full of water, all of it was utterly annihilated. It was the most terrifying, unambiguous amen in the history of the world. God had answered. For a long, stunned moment, there was a dead silence. The only sound was the crackling echo of the fire. The people, who had watched all day with casual interest, were now flattened on the ground, their faces in the very dust that God had just proven he could consume. The spectacle was over. The reality had begun. And then, as one, a single guttural cry rose from the thousands of prostrate bodies. It was a cry of terror, of awe, and of final undeniable belief. Verse 39. Now when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." This was the confession. This was the choice Elijah had demanded. The limp was over. The nation, in one voice, had declared its allegiance. Baal was a bloody, silent fraud. Yahweh was the God who answered by fire. Elijah, his face illuminated by the afterglow of the divine flame, let their confession hang in the air. But he wasn't finished. The verdict had been rendered, and now the sentence must be carried out. The God who had shown his power must now show his justice. He pointed to the 450 blood-soaked, terrified prophets of Baal who were now trying to slink away. His voice, now the voice of judgment, cut through the air. Verse 40, and Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. This was not an act of uncontrolled rage. It was an act of divine justice. The law of Moses was clear. Anyone who led Israel to worship other gods was to be put to death. These 450 men were not innocent priests. They were the spiritual cancer of the nation, state-sponsored agents of a rebellion that had resulted in the starvation of the entire populace. The people, their fear of God now fully restored by the fire from heaven, carried out the sentence. The land, which had been polluted by their pagan altars and their own bloodlettings, was now cleansed at the brook by the execution of those who had led the rebellion. The spiritual cancer had been cut out. The sky was still a cloudless burning bronze. But the reason for the drought, the organized state-sponsored worship of Baal, was now floating in the brook Kishon. The covenant had been re-established. The price had been paid. Justice was satisfied. With the land cleansed, Elijah, his clothes perhaps stained from the grim work of justice, turned his attention to the cowering king. Ahab had witnessed it all, the fire, the confession of the people, and the summary execution of his entire priesthood. He was a man undone, stripped of his gods and his authority. Elijah approached him. He didn't ask for permission. He gave a command. 1 Kings 18, verse 41. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain." Ahab must have looked at him like he was insane. The sound of rain. The only sound was the wind whistling over the parched, dusty mountaintop. There wasn't a speck of white in the blazing blue sky. But Elijah wasn't hearing with his ears. He was hearing with his faith. God had promised. The conditions had been met, and as far as Elijah was concerned, the rain was already a reality. Ahab, now completely subservient to the prophet's authority, went up to eat and drink, grateful to be dismissed from this terrifying scene. But Elijah did not feast. His work was not over. The fire had been God's part. The execution had been the people's part. Now the rain required his part. He went up to the top of Carmel, and there, at the very peak, overlooking the great sea, he assumed a posture of intense, agonizing intercession. Verse 42, then he bowed down on the ground and put his face between his knees. This wasn't the bold, standing prayer of confrontation. This was the posture of spiritual birth, a desperate, humble, all-consuming prayer. He was travailing for the nation, pressing his face to the earth, birthing the promise of rain into reality. He said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." The servant went, shielded his eyes, and scanned the vast empty horizon. He came back. There is nothing. Elijah, his face still between his knees, his body locked in prayer, said only, "Go again." The servant went, he looked. He returned, "There is nothing." "Go again," 7 times. 6 times the servant returned with the same report. Nothing, nothing, nothing. The sky was empty. Elijah's faith was being tested, stretched to its absolute limit. He refused to give up, refused to believe the report of his eyes over the promise of his God. And on the 7th trip, the servant returned, his voice different. Verse 44, then it came to pass the 7th time that he said, "There is a cloud as small as a man's hand rising out of the sea." That was it, that was the sign. A cloud the size of a fist. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Elijah, it was the abundance of rain. He sprang up from his prayer. The time for intercession was over. The time for action was now. He gave his servant an urgent command. "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The servant ran to Ahab, who, seeing the authority in the man's eyes and the first wisp of a cloud on the horizon, scrambled into his chariot. He didn't need to be told twice. He knew what a flash flood in those dry valleys could do. And as Ahab turned his chariot toward his palace in Jezreel, the sky began to change. 1 Kings 18, verse 45. Now it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain. It wasn't a gentle shower, it was a deluge. The abundance of rain that Elijah had heard in his spirit now burst forth in a torrent. The heavens, sealed for 3.5 years, were ripped open. The ground, which had been as hard as iron, was instantly churning to mud. The wadis and dry brooks became raging, brown rivers within minutes. Ahab, lashing his horses, was in a desperate race against the very storm his kingdom had been dying for. He was fleeing the answer to their prayers. And then something truly supernatural happened. As Ahab raced in his royal chariot, the prophet Elijah began his own journey to Jezreel. Verse 46 gives us this astonishing detail. Then the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. The hand of the Lord. This was a divine supernatural anointing of physical power. Elijah, a man who had just spent an entire day in a high-stakes spiritual confrontation, followed by the execution of 450 men, followed by an agonizing session of travailing prayer, was suddenly filled with the strength of God himself. He tucked his long, rough garment into his belt, girded up his loins, and he began to run. He wasn't just running. He was outrunning a royal chariot pulled by the king's finest horses in the middle of a blinding tropical-style storm. Imagine the sight, the sky black, the rain lashing down, King Ahab, his horses slipping and sliding in the mud, peering through the deluge. And then, silhouetted against the storm, is the figure of a man, the wild-haired prophet, his cloak flying behind him, running with the speed of a stallion, pulling away from the chariot. He was a living testament to the fact that the power of God was greater than any earthly power. Elijah didn't just meet Ahab at the city, he beat him there. He ran the entire distance, about 17 miles, and stood drenched and triumphant at the gate of Jezreel, the very city where Queen Jezebel held her dark court, as the king's chariot finally clattered in behind him. The man of God had served as the king's herald, announcing the arrival of both the reign and a new divine authority in Israel. He had faced the king, the priests, and the nation. Now he would face the queen. But the confrontation would not be face to face. Ahab, soaked to the bone, his royal authority completely shattered, stumbled into his palace in Jezreel. He was a broken man, and he went straight to the real power in the kingdom, his wife, Queen Jezebel. 1 Kings 19 verse 1 tells us, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword." He left nothing out. He described the fire from heaven, the supernatural consumption of the stones and the water, the unified cry of the people, "The Lord, He is God." And he told her how Elijah had ordered the slaughter of all 850 of her state-sponsored spiritual advisors. Ahab, who had witnessed the power of God, seemed almost neutral in his reporting, a man just stating the terrifying facts. But Jezebel was not moved. She was not converted. She was not even afraid. She was enraged. The fire from heaven meant nothing to her. The confession of the people only hardened her heart. All she heard was that her religious infrastructure had been destroyed, and her authority had been challenged by this one man. She was the one who had been massacring God's prophets, and now Elijah had killed hers. This was, in her mind, an act of war. She didn't consult her gods. She didn't call a council. She acted with the swift, cold malice that defined her. She sent a messenger to Elijah. This wasn't an arrest warrant. It was a personal vendetta, a demonic oath. Her message, recorded in 1 Kings 19 verse 2, is one of the most chilling threats in the Bible. "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." This was a blood oath. She was invoking her gods, swearing on her own life that within 24 hours, Elijah would be a dead man just like her prophets. It was a direct demonic challenge. Your God showed up today. My gods will have their revenge tomorrow, and I will be their instrument. And this message, this one personal threat from one woman, did what 850 priests, a hostile king, and a silent sky could not do. It broke Elijah, the man who had stood fearlessly on Mount Carmel, the man who had mocked an army of false prophets, the man who had called down fire and outrun a chariot, was suddenly, completely, and utterly terrified. 1 Kings 19 verse 3 says, "And when he saw that, when he saw not the hand of God, but the face of Jezebel's rage, he arose and ran for his life." This wasn't a strategic retreat. This was a panicked flight. He ran. He ran south, out of Jezreel, past the borders of the northern kingdom, not stopping until he reached Beersheba, a town on the farthest southern edge of Judah. He had crossed an entire country to get away from her. He left his servant there in the last outpost of civilization, and then he plunged alone into the vast, empty wilderness, the desert that stretched toward Sinai. He walked a day's journey into the wilderness. One full day of walking, pushing himself deeper into the desolation, fueled by nothing but fear and despair. Finally, at the end of his strength, his spirit, and his faith, the great prophet of fire collapsed. He sat down under a solitary broom tree, a meager patch of shade in the vast, burning emptiness. And the man who had faced down an army of priests now prayed for death. 1 Kings 19 verse 4, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he prayed that he might die, and said, "It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." He had seen fire from heaven, but a word from a wicked woman had shattered him. He fell asleep, giving in to the despair. But God was not finished with him. An angel touched him, waking him. "Arise and eat." Elijah looked, and there, by his head, was a cake baked on hot coals and a jar of water. He ate, he drank, and he lay down again, still consumed by his depression. The angel came a second time and touched him, saying, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." Fed by the hand of God, a new supernatural strength entered him. He arose, and on the strength of that one meal, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights, fueled by divine power, until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. This was Mount Sinai, the very place where God had given Moses the law, the place where the covenant was born. Elijah, seeking an answer, had gone back to the beginning. He found a cave and lodged there. And the word of the Lord came to him with a piercing question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah poured out his broken heart. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Then God gave a command, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And God passed by. A great and strong wind tore at the mountains, shattering the rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was a massive earthquake, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a raging fire swept the peak, the same element he had commanded on Carmel. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a still small voice, a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he knew. He wrapped his face in his mantle, unable to look, and stood at the entrance of the cave. The voice asked him the same question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah gave the exact same answer, "I have been zealous. I alone am left." His perspective was still broken. God's display of power hadn't changed his mind. So God gave him not an answer, but a mission. He gave him a new purpose. He commanded him to go and anoint 2 new kings, Hazael over Syria and Jehu over Israel, to be instruments of judgment. And then God gave him his real answer, "And Elisha the son of Shaphat, you shall anoint as prophet in your place." And God corrected his despair, "Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." You are not alone, Elijah. Your work is not over, but your successor is waiting. So Elijah went. He found Elisha plowing a field with 12 yoke of oxen. Elijah walked up to him, said nothing, and simply threw his own rough mantle over Elisha's shoulders. It was the call. Elisha understood instantly. He ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." He was given permission. And then Elisha slaughtered his oxen, boiled them on the wood of his own plow, and gave the meat to the people. He had burned his bridges. His old life was over. He arose and followed Elijah and became his servant. But Elijah's ministry was not finished. He was called back to confront Ahab one last time. The wicked king, stirred by Jezebel, had coveted a vineyard belonging to a man named Naboth. When Naboth refused to sell, Jezebel arranged for him to be falsely accused of blasphemy and stoned to death, so Ahab could seize the land. God sent Elijah to meet Ahab as he was taking possession of the vineyard. Ahab, seeing him, sneered, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" And Elijah pronounced the final grisly doom on his house. "I have found you. In the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth, dogs shall lick your blood, even yours." And of Jezebel the Lord also spoke, saying, "The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel." Ahab, for the first time, actually humbled himself, and God relented, delaying the judgment, but it was sealed. Elijah would confront Ahab's son, King Ahaziah, who fell and sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. Elijah intercepted them. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub?" He pronounced the king's death. When the king sent soldiers to capture him, Elijah, back in his element of fire, called down fire from heaven, consuming 2 captains and their 50 men. Finally, after a long and fiery life, the day came for God to take his prophet. Elijah knew it, Elisha knew it. Elijah tried to get his servant to stay behind, but Elisha swore, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." They crossed the Jordan River, Elijah striking the water with his mantle so it parted, just as Moses had done. And as they walked and talked, Elisha made his one great request. "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." Elijah replied, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you." And suddenly, as they were walking, 1 Kings 2, verse 11, a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire and separated the 2 of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha watched, his heart breaking, screaming, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen," and he saw him no more. He picked up the mantle that had fallen from Elijah, the very mantle that had called him from the plow, and he began his own ministry. This has been the story of Elijah the Tishbite, a man of the wilderness, a man of fire, a man of profound faith and profound despair. He was a man who stood alone, who challenged empires, who commanded the elements and who raised the dead. But he was also a man who ran from a single threat, who hid in a cave, and who had to be reminded by a gentle whisper that he was not alone, and that God's plan was far bigger than his own feelings. His life is a burning testament that one person, fully yielded to the living God, can bring a nation to its knees. He shows us that faith is not the absence of fear or depression, but the courage to get up after we have collapsed. His journey proves that God can use anyone, a wild man from Gilead, unclean ravens, a pagan widow, a quiet servant. And his departure, not into a grave, but into a whirlwind, is the ultimate reminder that for those who walk so closely with God, death itself has no sting, and the final word is not ashes, but fire. Elijah's story is not just a record of the past, it is a question for your present. If this message ignited your spirit, if it challenged you to stop faltering between 2 opinions, then subscribe to this channel and join this journey. Press the like button to show that you stand for the truth. And in the comments below, answer this: which part of Elijah's story spoke to you? The fire on Carmel or the whisper in the cave? Your voice matters. Share this video with one person you know who needs to be reminded that the God of Elijah is still the living God. Do not be silent.